So today we're talking about religious language, which is chapter 1.8 on the OCR ALevel Religious Studies specification. So firstly, look at these key terms and try to define them in your own words. Try to pause the video and see whether you can get as close to them before we head on to the actual definitions in the OCR specification. So hopefully you got the same definition, but the via-negativa or the apophatic way is a way of speaking about God and theological studies or ideas using only terms that say what God is not. And that's a really important aspect here, is what God is not. Whilst the via-positiva or the cathartic way is a range of ways of speaking about God and theological ideas using only terms that say what God is. So you can see the difference of the negativa and the positiva, or see positive and negative terms of speaking about God or religious language. Then we have this word called analogy. So an analogy is a comparison made between one thing and another in aid to help understanding. And we'll look at which philosophers really use this, and there's two different types that we're really going to look into specifically. Then we have symbolism. So symbolism is a word or other kind of representation used to stand for something else and to shed light on its meaning. So again, different ways in which religious language can be used through symbols and representations of what religious thinkers really believe. So overall, religious language issues are issues of whether the ordinary language of the everyday physical world can actually be used to convey ideas or make truth claims about God, the afterlife, or other spiritual issues. So for example, if religious believers say something like God is love, is that something that we can use in order to convey what God is in this world? Or are there other ways that we could do that? Which is what this topic really looks into. So the uses of religious language, there are many different ways that religious believers or people talking about religious language can really talk about. So the first is to make truth claims. So like I gave the example earlier, God is love. Is that a truth claim that religious believers can really make? That's what we're going to be looking into. But this is the way that religious believers do really use their religious language. The other way is to evoke feelings of worship, to express emotion, to solemnize occasions. So this could be things like weddings, funerals, baptisms, name any religious celebration or occasion that you might have, even within a mass or a synagogue service or whatever religion you want to delve into. And the last one is to pray. So obviously whenever religious believers pray, they use specific language, such as God give me strength, or God be my father, be my protector, all of that kind of stuff, and again looks into the way that religious language can be used. So first we're going to look into the via-negativa or the apophatic way. So supporters of the via-negativa claim that in order to say things that are literally true of God, we can only use negative terms. So this might be a bit confusing because it's really talking about what you can't, what God is not, rather than what he is. And we're going to look into why this really is and what philosophers think about this. So negative terms might include things like invisible, incorporeal, timeless. They're not giving a limit to anything that religious believers might say about God. There are no limits because we don't want to limit God. So this is because using positive terms of God makes God seem too small. So if God is like a human father or judge, and as if God has only human wisdom or strength. So again, it's really trying to not limit God to a human capacity, but make it beyond that. And a lot of philosophers argue, again we'll look at who, that this is the only way that this can be done is through negative terms or negative ways of talking about God. So Pseudo-Dionysius, the Agapite, lived in the 6th century, and he was really influential in developing the via-negativa. So he argued that people need to go through beyond the need for understanding and enter a cloud of unknowing. And this cloud of unknowing is really important here of the via-negativa. So he's basically saying that we cannot understand fully what God is. Our human minds, even the most smartest person with the highest IQ on the planet, will never fully understand or comprehend what God is. That's because our human capacity is too small. So therefore, we need to accept this cloud of unknowing, and this will be the only way that we can really understand what God is through not knowing him fully. And this is what the via-negativa is all about, being in this cloud of unknowing, and that is what we really can know about God. Again, there's lots of criticisms about this, and we'll look into it later. But this is what Pseudo-Dionysius said is really important. We cannot fully know what God is. This won't make him too small. So Moses Maimonides, which is on the right over here, he lived in the 12th century, and he gave the example of describing a ship by explaining what it is not, to illustrate how the knowledge of God can be communicated. So if you look at this image of the ship on the screen, if I say, well, a ship doesn't have wheels, it doesn't go on the road, it doesn't have wings. This is kind of what he's saying is, in the same way I've just described a ship, we can describe God. He's timeless, he is invisible, all of these kind of things. It's all these negative things that we can really build an idea around what the thing is. So by me saying a ship doesn't go on the road, you can then see that it doesn't look like a car that you might know. It doesn't go on the road. So instead you might imagine something without wheels, like a ship doesn't have wheels. However, you can kind of already notice that it's not really giving us a full picture of what the ship actually looks like, unless we actually see a picture. So in the same way, it's not really giving us any idea of what God actually is. And that's one of the really big criticisms of the via-negativa. And we'll look at more criticisms in a minute. So the positives of the via-negativa is that it can produce statements which are literally true rather than requiring an interpretation. Because if I say God is timeless, that doesn't really require an interpretation for different ways of understanding what timeless is. Timeless means there isn't a limit to the time. So therefore it is quite an accurate and literally true representation. Statements using the via-negativa can also be meaningful across different times and different cultures. And this is because, again, there's no different interpretation. It can apply to all cultures because all religions will even agree on the statement that God is timeless, apart from Buddhism, that it's timeless, that he's timeless, and also that he is invisible. We can't see him unless, obviously, you have a religious experience, but that's a whole other thing. So in that way, it's already crossing across different cultures, which is a universal concept which people can agree on. So again, it's giving that sense of the literal truth rather than those interpretations. But of course, there are many criticisms of the via-negativa. And one of them, that it could be argued that the via-negativa is not of much help when it comes to understanding God, because if someone doesn't know anything about God, for example, if an alien came down from, Mars, and you would try to explain what God was by saying, well, God's invisible and he's timeless, it doesn't really give the alien an idea of what God actually is. So therefore, defining God in negative terms it's not very different from saying that he's nothing at all and that he doesn't exist. So therefore, it's a really big criticism of using these negative terms towards God, because it doesn't actually build the picture of what he is, just like I said in the ship example. The other big one is that the Bible uses only positive terms of God, and so does Jesus in the Bible. So we only see things such as God is love, God is a father, which we'll look into the symbolism aspects of it later on as well. But this is a really big criticism of why the via-negativa isn't really used by theists. So the second type, like we said, is the via-positiva, or the cathartic way. And there are two ways in which religious believers might use positive terms to communicate ideas about God. And one of them is through analogy, like we said earlier, and symbol. So analogy is a comparison, like we said, made between one thing and another in an effort to aid understanding. And analogical language contrasts with univocal language, where the words are used in exactly the same way. and equivocal language, because here words have a completely different meaning. So that's not what this is. An analogy is just this comparison to help this understanding. So there's a link in between the two things. So Thomas Aquinas was really big on using these analogies. And he argued that whenever we speak of God, we use an analogy, whether we mean to or not. And you will recognise Aquinas from natural moral law as well. So remember that link of this philosopher, which would also actually really help you in terms of your 40-mark questions when it comes to OCR, because you can really link these topics together. Aquinas also thought that recognising that we are using analogy really helps to avoid the problems of making God too small. This is because we can always remember that there is this understanding that there is a comparison made rather than it being literal. And the third thing is that Aquinas divides analogy into two kinds. The first is the analogy of attribution, and then we have the analogy of proportionality. So, analogy of attribution is where there is a causal relationship between the things described. So, for example, when we speak of God as loving, we need to remember that God is the cause of love. And when we speak of God as wise, we should remember that God is the cause of wisdom. And you can kind of see how this is quite similar to Aquinas' cosmological argument, if you look at the argument for motion and causation, because we're really looking at the fact that Aquinas says, well, all these planets were put into motion, and the unmoved mover is God, because he is the cause of that motion. So think about it in that way, because this attribution just means he is the cause. He did the thing. Then the second type of analogy is analogy of proportionality. And again, it's just literally proportionate to what God is. So when I say that analogy relates to things, there are different in proportions. So we really need to remember that when we speak of God, that his attributes are on an infinitely greater scale than of mine. So for example, if I say, I am wise, I have to remember when I said God is wise, I am wise in my small scale as a human being. Whilst when I say God is wise, he is larger on an even infinitely greater scale. And as long as I remember that that's the contribution and the link that we're trying to make here, that God is much greater than that. And you can really understand this through Paley's watch analogy in the design argument. So, if you remember, Paley says that if I find a watch on a heath, I will automatically assume it has a designer because of its intricacy, the wheels and cogs causing motion, all of these kind of specific things that cause it to tell the time. And in the same way, when I look at the world, I infer a designer. And he infers it's God because the world is on an infinitely greater scale than the watch itself. So therefore, its designer must also be larger than the watchmaker of the watch. So therefore, he infers it's God. And this is an analogy you can really use to help illustrate Aquinas' analogy of proportionality. And Ian Ramsey also wrote in 1957 about analogy using models and qualifiers. So we can take an idea from this limited physical world and use it as a model. We can use other words such as infinitely or wholly to indicate that the world is being applied analogically to an infinite being who will always remain beyond our human comprehension. So again, he's just establishing and expanding on what Thomas Aquinas has already said with this models and qualifiers aspect. Then we have symbol, and you can see loads of religious symbols here on the left. So symbols are word or other kind of representation used to stand for something else to shed light on its meaning. So for example, when we look at Christianity, you always have the image of the cross, because that's kind of the main concept of Christianity, is Jesus' death and resurrection. And then all these other symbols also have meanings. So through this, all language is also symbolic, because in that words stand for something else than the things that they represent. And we use metaphors in many contexts to aid understanding here and aid this vividness. which we'll go into. But that's really an important aspect here for that, because using symbolism can be a way of saying positive things about God without actually making him too small at all. So again, avoiding the problem that there was in the via negativa. So the Bible uses symbolic language of God. So one of these really big examples is saying that the Lord is my shepherd, which is in Psalm, or that God is my father. Because you need to think about whenever you have these quotes from the Bible or anywhere else that you pull them from, really need to analyze what this means. So the Lord is my shepherd. Well, what does a shepherd represent? It represents a leader, someone that has a flock, and the flock of the sheep follow them in trust. And that's what the analogy or the symbolism here is that Lord God or Jesus is the leader, and it has a group of followers. And that is obviously Jesus' disciples and believers in Jesus. Whilst when we talk about God being a father, think about all the aspects that a father comes across. So this would be wisdom, protector, carer, wanting the best for you, all of those kind of things, right? Being there when you're sad and need help. So in that sense, really think about what a human father would have, and remember it symbolically in terms of God. And this can also be done from image. So if you look here at Michelangelo's painting of the creation of Adam and Eve, you have here to the right here. This is God, represented as Michelangelo saw him. So again, whenever we look at God, a lot of the time he's represented as an old man with a long beard. And this can also represent wisdom, because we wouldn't look at Adam here and think he's wise. He might be, but it's not really what it's representing, because we need to remember that God has all the knowledge and wisdom. He also is always illustrated as quite muscular, which also can illustrate strength. And obviously here you can also see how he's kind of protected by these angels, which show his importance. And here obviously creating his man in his own image here. So again, you can see all these symbolisms of what a father might be, but this is done through art, so that's obviously a symbolic aspect. So you can really illustrate this through Michelangelo's work if you want to as well. Then we have Paul Tillich, and here he is on the right. So he was a Protestant theologian of the 20th century, and he had a theology of correlation, showing the relation between the questions raised in philosophy, the arts, psychology, and history with the answers offered in theology. So again, it's using a different way of symbolism through arts, philosophy, psychology, history, rather than actual imagery. So he argued that all religious language is symbolic, and he taught that they participate in the things to which they point, rather than being the things they point. So Tillich thought that understanding religion as symbolic in this way can help us understand God as the ground of all being. So again, like I said earlier, the fact that God is the creator of everything, and this symbol just helps to represent and reflect that through a way that we as humans can understand. So it's all a metaphor in order to help this understanding. But what are some criticisms of analogy and symbol as a way of speaking about God? I'll let you have a pause and maybe pause this video and think about it in your own terms before I start going into them. So the first one is that using ideas from the limited, imperfect physical world to express ideas about God might again make God too small. So again, we have this concept of God being too small than he actually is because of our human understanding. So in this way, we can say that analogies actually aren't that helpful, although they might be more helpful than the via negativa. However, they still make God too small, because people don't always remember about it being an analogy and a comparison. They sometimes think that it is literally true, which is a mistake here. Using positive terms to speak of God might also wrongly suggest that God can, that human beings can come to understand God, which, like I said earlier, we as limited human beings, even the smartest person on the planet, will not fully understand God, because God is just too big for us to fully comprehend. And if we use analogy and symbol knowing that the terms we use are only a partial, smaller shadow of the greatness of God, we don't come to a clear understanding of what he is. So again, it's similar to this cloud of unknowing that we spoke about in the via negativa. It still doesn't give us a clear understanding of what God is. So therefore, analogies and symbols can require just too much interpretation, and we don't always know if we are interpreting them correctly. So again, when I say God is a shepherd, or the Lord is my father, all these things, people might have different experiences of what a father is. Like, for example, some people have a very loving father. Some people might have an absent father. Some people might have an abusive father. Some people might have a father that's very into sport. All these different aspects. So in this way, it doesn't build a clear image of what a father could be, because people have different experiences. So again, it has these too many interpretations and metaphors of illustrating what God is. So this is a really big criticism of using analogies and symbolism in this way. So some symbols can change in meaning over time, or different between different cultures. Or, for example, a really big one I always use is the swastika symbol. So here we have Nazi Germany swastika symbol on the left, which is, you can see here. And on the right, we have the Indian, or the Buddhist and the Hindu symbol for ahimsa. And again, you can see they're very similar. Hitler really used the Hindu Buddhist symbol as a model. And I don't know about you or anyone else listening, but the Nazi symbol is very strong in Europe. It brings out a lot of negative connotations. Whilst the Buddhist symbol and the Hindu symbol is the opposite. So when we look at Nazi Germany and the swastika, the things that come about to us are Hitler, the dictatorship, genocide, the Holocaust, hate, war, power used wrongfully, all these really negative, really dark things. Whilst the ahimsa symbol it actually means, ahimsa means no harm to any living being. So again, very drastically different. It brings about peace and respect. So again, you can see here how a symbol has been used and changed meaning over time, but also in a different culture. So again, you can really illustrate this through this example as a really big criticism of symbols in general. So here you have some AO1 knowledge that you can pause this video and reflect upon. There's this one, and there's also this one. So have a pause in between the video and see whether you can reply and respond to all of these questions. If you can, means you have all the AO1 knowledge that you need, and you just need to work on the analysis. But using all the examples that I've given you are going to really help in order to boost your essay practice. Here you've got some exam practice, as practice always makes perfect. So the first question that would be really great if you did an essay plan to, or even did a full 40 mark question, is how effective is analogy in communicating religious ideas and beliefs? Or symbol is too often misleading for it to be useful in religious language. Discuss. So have a really think about how you can use all the content that I've applied here into the application within the question, and see whether you can really use all of this with the application, the analysis, the examples, to really build a really strong 40 mark question. Hope you enjoyed this video, and join me next time for more philosophy, ethics and religious studies.